Hello, everyone, and welcome to the farm. Today I'm joined by Christopher Knowles and Stephen Snider. Today's episode will center around the whimsical time traveling adventures of Doctor Who and just how influential the BBC show has been over the decades. Like all franchises beloved by millions all over the world, a decision was made very recently to focus on the demands of the social justice obsessed few instead of its actual canon. Previously on the show, we've discussed comics and other media, which foresaw strange monuments on the moon and Mars, particularly in the case of Jack Kirby, Willie Ley, Philip K. Dick, and others. These ideas can also be found in Doctor Who, and in some cases, these people tell nearly identical stories across different mediums. One of the landmark episodes, I think, in everybody's opinion, is the Pyramids of Mars. Stephen, what about the Pyramids of Mars reminded you of either stuff in the real world or other fictional franchises?
Well, I mean, quite a bit, obviously. I mean, it's clearly been a hugely influential series of episodes that were strung together. Of course, the most obvious one would be the fact that the Stargate franchise really seems to have almost completely stolen its entire premise from this. Basically, you have the whole notion of an extraterrestrial race based on the planet Mars that took on the personification of the gods of ancient Egypt and so forth, and they're trying to use a portal to return to the Earth and effectively enslave humanity again, or something to that effect. So. Yeah, I mean, this is definitely very in keeping with what was going on with Stargate, in the 90s and so forth. But of course, you have a lot of the strange ideals that were bubbling up in the 70s. That was sort of concurrent with it. Of course, you almost immediately think of the real life notions of the pyramids of Mars that Richard Hoagland has been talking about for years now. And that's why I was actually quite surprised looking at the group Pyramid on Facebook that Frank and I are both involved with, where several of the readers were suggesting that Pyramids of Mars had actually predated the release of some of the images from Mars that allegedly showed a pyramid in the first place. So, that in and of itself is quite incredible. And then, of course, you have this sort of notion of the nine lingering in the background who had of themselves, of course, claimed to be an extraterrestrial race that had taken on the personification of the great Enid, the gods of ancient Egypt, and so forth. And they had really just been revealed to the public in earnest in 1974, just a couple of years before Pyramids of Mars was released. I believe it was, what, 77, I think?
Uh,
76.
Which the nine?
No, no, not the pyramid, the Doctor Who episode Pyramids of Mars.
No, I know. But what was revealed in
Well,
1977?
that was when Puharek published Yuri, which, from what I can recall, that was the first time the Nine had really gotten a lot of exposure to the public at large, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, no. Uri was the Uri Geller book was published in 74.
Yes, I mean, it was about, like, what, about 3 years or something before the Doctor Who episode, if I remember correctly. I can't remember if it was 76 or 77 off the top of my head, but it was right in the same time frame, and then kind of going into some of the stuff that we've been talking about in regards to the Stars Academy and the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, I certainly found it interesting that the portal that was being opened up to this extraterrestrial entity was essentially meant to be a play on the Egyptian god Set, who Peter Lavindia would, of course, famously equate with the Dark Lord in recent years. So effectively, yes, it's a portal that was kind of opened up for this sole purpose of bringing the Dark Lord effectively into our world, and this kind of jives with some of the more out there theories associated to Kenneth Grant and so forth, with the abyss essentially being used as a gateway to the dark side of the tree of life or something to that effect, in which this Dark Lord entity can be summoned forth with. So it definitely seems to really have done an incredible job of tapping into the zeitgeist from that era. It's just, in a lot of ways, it's really mind blowing at how forward looking it was, and kind of tapping into these really obscure notions that were just then beginning to infect pop culture in the 70s.
Certainly. Yeah, I think the Nine thing is really interesting, even if the book had come out before the episode. I feel like a lot of people, in that era weren't really aware of the Nine. I don't think it was discussed much. I think a few people might have read about it. I don't know if it got to the people making Doctor Who, but you touched on something really interesting right at the beginning there. which is kind of the theme I opened up with. So you have the pyramids of Mars, and it makes you wonder, did they know somebody at NASA or something? If they got that information before the images were made public, there's a similar Jack Kirby connection in him sort of prophesying these things and having some sort of connection to someone at NASA, but we haven't really been able to tie down what information would have been exchanged or if some of Jack Kirby's ideas came from that. And then you have this idea, again, going back to Richard Hoagland, who's found that Willie Lay's fiction, Tom Corbett, and the Viewmaster slides that were made for the Viewmaster version of Tom Corbett have all kind of tetrahedral crystals and pyramids and the face on Mars and everything else. And of course, Willie Lay was one of von Braun's great friend, and von Braun, on his deathbed, of course, came up with the false flag alien invasion idea, which is the actual plot of the aliens of London. Hold on, let me get the exact name of yeah, Aliens of London. It's also called World War III, which is relevant to today in some ways, I suppose. But I just thought that was a weird connection. I mean, they have, they totally like make aliens out of some weird genetic hybrids and crash it into the London Bridge. It's the classic tale in all the cartoons I always bring up about the government, falsifying an alien invasion to justify more control or something like that. Um, so then there's this other crossover between um, a lot of ideas that Philip K. Dick had, and one of those comes to light in the sequel to the episode Extremis. So I guess I should start with Extremis connects ideas about the Anunnaki, even showing a lot of visuals, and the narrative is very close to the way the Anunnaki is explained in Iron Sky 2. Extremis also has pyramids in it, the Pentagon, and CERN. The idea with CERN is that perhaps through religious and psycho-spiritual and mathematical and physics ideas all combined, that they're somehow altering our reality, like a Mandela effect kind of thing. Now, the product of that is the next episode, which is the alien overlords have changed our media, changed our history, changed our memories, so that they have only landed a month ago in the time that the show's happening, but everyone's already been converted to thinking they've been watching over and changing humanity for the entire history of our species. So that sequel to Extremis is so very close to like the series V, but it's identical to Man in the High Castle, sort of rewriting American history with everything slightly changed to this, Fourth Reich timeline. The sequel to Extremis, it's just the alien Anunnaki timeline or whatever, but they're referred to as uh, monks. They're these like dead zombie-esque monks, which is strange because they hang out in this pyramid, do all their business from this one pyramid where the world's militaries meet up with them. And then there's an episode of uh, Spider, Spider Woman, where the pyramids are flying around and they contain like these alien mummies or whatever. There's even a line from the episode. They're trying to turn everyone into spaced out mummies, which is sort of very similar to this idea of the monks being using dead human vessels or whatever and trying to convert everyone or mind control everyone into being their zombies, mummies. It has a very similar visual in both shows.
Well, the other thing to me that was really interesting about Extremis too is it really kind of goes into the whole, simulation theory and what have you too. Effectively, at the end of this particular episode, you find out that the monks had essentially created an alternative universe digitally effectively, then they had filled it with exact recreations of everybody on Earth or affiliated with Earth, including the Doctor himself. And it's only kind of at the end, they kind of discover this weird room where they have the projectors that are going out to different focal points in the Earth, such as the CERN facility and the Pentagon and the Vatican and so forth. Of course, the text that sort of alerts these characters to the fact that they are living in a simulation is found in the Vatican itself, in the kind of a library of forbidden books and so forth. Essentially, everybody who's read this text has ultimately committed suicide because they essentially realize that they're not real and it's a form of escape from this world. So there's definitely a very strong hint of Gnosticism into this stew that was kind of thrown in as well, in addition to a lot of the theories that have become so prevalent in Silicon Valley with simulation and
That read the text that offed themselves,
yes,
actually
absolutely.
thinking that they're going to this better place, which is hell, as it's referred to, or the loosely translated as the underworld.
Exactly. So, I mean, you have this whole kind of demiurgic kind of notion affiliated with the monks as well from this initial episode, and it's a little disappointing, at least to me, that they didn't go into that more in the latter two that were connected to a pyramid at the end of the world, and whatever the third part was called. But certainly, Extremis definitely seems to tap into a lot of tropes that we've talked about in this show before, and some of the ones that have become really prevalent in general in the broader popular culture in recent years.
And it's not the only time that we learn that the TARDIS has sort of a universal connection to the Pentagon, the pyramids, and the CERN facility. It's not the only episode where the Doctor has kind of a quicker route to those places because it's already kind of connected to the ley lines of those very important places. And then when they're realizing that the doors in the TARDIS either go to the Pentagon or CERN, etc. That's kind of the same setting that they realize their world is a simulation. I just thought that was absolutely brilliant to fit all that in there, with the apocryphal text and the Vatican and everything else.
Absolutely.
So there's this other episode, The God Complex, which is, I think a lot of sync people would really enjoy it. It's sort of a whole episode based off the Overlook Hotel, or at least the mischievous nature of room 37, and each room containing someone's worst nightmare. But I think they play with The Shining a lot in that episode. Does anybody have anything interesting they found about that one, or did anyone watch that one?
Yeah, I had actually seen that one a couple of weeks ago, even before we had decided to do the show. And yeah, I mean, the whole kind of Shining reference is really prevalent throughout it. And just the fact that the alien in question that you sort of ultimately revealed behind it is really obsessed with trying to get his victims to accept their eventual destruction and so forth, which was certainly very curious. And yeah, I mean, it really does do a great job of playing into some of the more incredible stuff associated with the Kubrick version of The Shining, and certainly, of course, a lot of conspiracy theories over the years have thought that there were a lot of hints in The Shining about the staged moon landing and so forth. So certainly you kind of figure out at the end of the episode that this whole Overlook-esque hotel that they've been running around in for the duration of the episode essentially is in some kind of spaceship or something to that effect by this ancient alien who just he's, I think, the last one of his kind and so forth, and is effectively dying, or at least the Doctor convinces him that it's finally time to give up the ghost, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely quite a heavy amount of sinks and various points in it. And then, of course, you see the references to a lot of the villains that appeared in the new series, some of the more noteworthy ones, especially the Weeping Angels as well.
Yeah, and the silence. So I wanted to talk about for a second. I find it really interesting that they're a hybrid of they have the physicality of the tall, skinny, creepy guy. Hold on, I'm trying to remember the Slender Man. They have the physicality of the Slender Man and would look like Slender Man from the back, sort of. But then their skull resembles a gray alien or a tall gray, however you want to put that. And then their powers are reminiscent of alien abduction to manipulate the the memory once you see them. In alien abduction, it always seems to be the person is hypnotized by the eyes of the Greys and they can't stop talking about them or staring into them or whatever, wherein they start losing memories. And so if you look at these particular Doctor Who villains, you lose all memory of interacting with them, possibly more surrounding memories, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think really the Silence were probably, well, it'd be hard to kind of say between the Weeping Angels and the Silence, but both of them were really, I think, the two best villains that were unveiled in the new series, along with the classic ones like the Cybermen and the Daleks and so forth. But the Silence kind of ironically were partly inspired by the famous painting, The Scream, actually, which has become a bit of a trope in recent years with the Trump era and a lot of memes and so forth on Facebook, kind of inspired by it, I suppose, as a kind of protest against the orange one. But yeah, like Frank is saying, I mean, the Silence effectively, you lose all memory of them when you're not looking at them directly and so forth. And as the show advances, it's kind of revealed that the Silence had originally begun as an order of monks for the Church of the Papal Mainframe, essentially. So again, you sort of see this kind of strange reference to the Vatican housing some of these really arcane notions and so forth. Of course, in the case of the Silence, I mean, they've even taken this off world, and gradually the monks in this instance kind of morph into the Silence in this process of confession that they've developed. The sinner essentially forgets their confession immediately afterwards. But the Silence, obviously, they bring in the whole notion of the Greys, which Frank had gotten into, but also the Men in Black as well. They have kind of the omnipresent black suits and so forth, which gives them that air, especially when you consider that they have essentially been rewriting humanity's history from potentially the very beginning and so forth, kind of suppressing this arcane and forbidden knowledge and so forth, much as a lot of UFOologists have alleged that the Men in Black do as well. And curiously, the first appearance well, the Silence had been referenced, I believe, throughout the sixth series, but the first time they really show up in earnest is in the two-part Impossible Astronaut and the Day of the Moon. And it's kind of interesting because really one of the heroes of this turns out to be Richard Nixon. Ironically, of course, they go back into I think 1969 or something like that, where they end up working with the Nixon White House effectively to crush the Silence. And this kind of goes into some interesting things that I've written about with the Nine before, but certainly there's been a lot of research going into the sort of vague connections that the Nine had with the Kennedy assassination, but to some extent, the degrees of separation were not as far removed with Watergate either. Of course, one of the more infamous Watergate plumbers was James McCord, who had cut his teeth working with the Office of Security in the 1950s during the height of Artichoke. He might even have been one of the guys detached to investigate / suppress the death of Frank Olson. So McCord was in league with Paul Gaynor and some of these other guys who had been supporting Uharic uh, in his work with Artichoke, which also kind of dovetailed with the original seances for the Nine in the 1952, I think, New Year's Eve or something to that effect. So McCord is kind of there in Watergate, which unfolds in 1974, which, as I got into earlier, also was the year when the Nine were first sort of revealed through the publication of Yuri. So it's kind of interesting to me that Nixon did show up as a character here, and even as a rather in a rather favorable light, which is certainly odd considering the normal depictions that you see of Nixon. But as I've talked about before, I mean, Nixon was not necessarily more evil than a lot of the presidents that have come after him, probably less so. And his foreign policy did kind of bizarrely go into the elimination of the powerful China lobby throughout his administration. Specifically, I'm talking about Taiwan, the Republic of China, which had really had just a prevalent influence on the United States foreign policy throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in much the same way the Israeli lobby did to this day, or does to this day, I should say. So, yeah, I mean, there's kind of some hints of that. Nixon's sort of subtle war with the China lobby in real life, his subtle war with the Silence and Doctor Who and so forth, and this, again, kind of bizarre linkage to the Nine and so forth. And curiously, if I remember correctly, in the books that Mark Frost wrote, regards to the new Twin Peaks series that had just come out a couple of years ago, Nixon also kind of appeared prevalently in that as well, kind of working against these sinister forces. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting the image makeover that Nixon has kind of gotten in some of these really curious science fiction and other types of series in recent years.
Yeah, it almost seems like with Doctor Who, a lot of depictions of American military and politicians or whatever are just to show them in a positive light, in the sense that if we were ever invaded by something off-world, we'd all forget our problems and come together and do the right thing. It's almost like there's no time to focus on maybe their real-world faults or what they were involved because there's just sort of an overarching narrative to show everyone coming together for the greater good.
Well, yeah, I mean, Doctor Who's definitely always been, knee deep in a lot of this kind of globalist propaganda. I mean, I guess the first time I'm not 100% sure because I'm not uber familiar with the extent of all of the original series, but from what I can recall, one of the earliest was with one of the Cybermen episodes with the second Doctor. But effectively, it was the first time we saw units, the United Nations intelligence, something like that. But it was basically this global force that the UN had assembled to counter the Cybermen and these other, kind of extraterrestrial threats and so forth. And unit, of course, would continue to appear throughout, both the original run of Doctor Who and the new series as well, especially in the form of the Brigadier, one of the more reoccurring companions the Doctor had over the years. So certainly, I mean, this has been present in the Doctor Who series going back to at least the late 60s.
Yeah, and in Extremis we see the U.S., China, and Russia all send a military representative, or a general rather, to kind of decide how to save the world. It seems that those are the overarching powers, if something like that were to happen. And so it's the three military leaders with the doctor trying to figure out what to do about the monks or CERN or any aspect of that. I thought it was really interesting how CERN was depicted as not only able to cause the Mandela effect or ripples in our reality or whatever, but also sort of quirky, out of the box. It just reminded me of that video that CERN released with all the dancing and the singing and so forth. It seemed like that was almost made by the Doctor Who, directors or writers or whatever who did Extremis.
Oh, hopefully it was in a more, like I said, with CERN, you could really debate whether or not it would be optimistic circumstances or not. But the kind of partying and extremis, I believe, is shortly before the members of CERN were about to blow themselves up collectively to escape the simulation.
Right, right, yeah. Um, is there any other episodes off the top of either of you guys' heads that you wanted to discuss?
You want to take that one, Chris?
Well, I wanted to just go back and do pyramids of Mars because I think there's a lot more meat on that bone.
Oh, yeah.
Um, you know, Stephen had mentioned that the Stargate franchise, this enormous franchise, I believe they're working on a new movie at present or a new series. I'm not exactly sure. I've heard both, but it really comes out of a very interesting time when this, as Stephen mentioned, that a lot of this stuff was really circulating. But I think there are some interesting connections that we shouldn't overlook, and one of which was the fact that at that point in time, so we're talking like mid 70s, I don't believe that the Viking photos with Cydonia and so on were released until the following year. I mean, they were taken in 76, but I don't think they were released until much later. But I believe at this point in time, the 9 operation had sort of shifted from Puharich, who was sort of flaking out and kind of, it seemed like he was on the outs at that point in time. I'm Do you remember when the fire at the turkey farm was in Ossining? Does either of you guys remember that, when his estate was basically torched and burned to the ground?
Yeah, I remember. I
It,
think it was around like 75, 76. Yeah, roughly speaking.
yeah, yeah, and I know that Uri Geller had the Geller Kids operation there before that, prior to the fire. So, but what I'm trying to get at here is that the sort of the locus of the operation moved from Puharich, and I think Puharich was just too much of a liability at this point in time, because he was such a lunatic, and his brains were just so addled from constant mushroom taking that I believe that a guy named Sir John Whitmore, who was a race car driver in Britain, and I know he had some connections to the BBC itself, but he had basically taken control of the Nine operation, and that for instance, a British writer named Stuart Holroyd was kind of tasked to do, the big rollout, a book called Briefings for the Landing on Planet Earth. Around that time, there was a celebrity psychic named Gene Dixon who had said that, that UFOs were going to land on Mars in 1977. And there's a very fascinating documentary that William Shatner had gotten involved with. It was actually German made, and then it was overdubbed, with American content. And I believe it's Mysteries of the Gods. I'm not exactly sure on the title, but so there's a lot of this stuff going on. You had the Chariots of the Gods stuff still very much in circulation. There were sort of a series of documentaries with Rod Serling that were expanding on the von Daniken information, and that eventually evolved into In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. But that was all the same group, and that were all the same producers. It started off with, I believe it was called In Search of Ancient Astronauts, was the original documentary. So you had a lot of this stuff at the time. There was a documentary with again with Serling. I know Jacques Vallée was in it. Burgess Meredith. Some very interesting people from the Blue Book operation that were involved in that. But the point I'm trying to make is, well, there's a number of points I want to make here. But the fact that this shows up in the 70s and in 76 on the BBC on Doctor Who, which was a huge hit in Britain and in parts of Europe, and had a major cult following, or it was to develop a major cult following a bit later in the US through its airings on PBS. But the fact that you had this this very explicit outgrowth of that kind of mythology, that Nine mythology and the ancient astronaut stuff showing up in the BBC, I think is really significant, because I think it's a reflection of the fact that the center of gravity in the Nine operation, which was pretty, it was a big project. A lot of money being put into this, and as we've said in the past, enlisting people like Gene Roddenberry into acting as sort of the promotional tools for this operation. But as I've mentioned before, I believe that Jenny O'Connor, who sort of became the de facto director of Esalen and Big Sur, probably because she was bonking Dick Price blind. I think that she was one of Whitmore's people. I think she was kind of in that orbit. And the fact that that milieu where so you're going from, so this is how it's kind of going here. You're going from Puharich. So Puharich is sort of like he's where is he? What fort is he at? What base is he at,
Dietrich?
Stephen? Was it Fort Dietrich?
I believe so.
Yeah, I
And there was
believe so.
another one too, right? There was another one. He was
Yeah.
involved in like chemical warfare and things like that before he really started getting heavily into the mushroom stuff. So I mean, so let's trace this. So we're looking at Puharich. Puharich enlists the host of One Step Beyond, and then they do that very famous episode with the sacred mushroom, and then that
I'm sorry,
that
Chris, it's Edgewood Arsenal and Fort Detrick.
Yes.
Please go.
that's what I was thinking. Yeah. So that guy John Newland gets involved with Star Trek, and he sort of inserts the basic nine mythology into Star Trek, and you see a number of variations on that through the original series. And then they're trying to get Roddenberry involved in it, and Roddenberry at that point is just a drunk and a lech who's he's not really producing anything. So I think that the same people behind the scenes might have gotten involved with the Doctor Who people. I think this, just the timing. So it could either be that this stuff is just so prevalent in the culture at the time that it's bouncing around. But I have a very strong sense, like a very strong intuition that people in Sir John Whitmore's orbit had somehow gotten people in the Doctor Who production office at least to do one of these series. And then what happens then is that Whitmore then sends Jenny O'Connor over to California, and she basically takes control of Esalen, which had been started with Rockefeller money. So at this point in time, Esalen is not, it's not what it had later become in the 80s when it was used as a venue for the Rockefeller's Russia program. And it's not what it was in the 60s when it was like the hip hot place. I mean, this is a point in time when Esalen is kind of in a fallow period. So you could have this this very strange seductress take charge of this, through her Svengali-like hold on Dick Price, because at that point in time, Michael Murphy was not really involved. He was living in San Francisco and sort of running a branch office, an Esalen branch office in San Francisco proper. But so there's a very interesting thing happening here, because at that point in time, concurrent with that, we have production begin on the Star Trek the motion picture, which starts to feed in a lot of these ideas. Roddenberry's produces that, and basically gets fired because cost overruns and just basically overall incompetence. And Harv Bennett, who I think produced the $6 Million Man, shows like that. I mean, he's given reins to the Star Trek movie franchise, but in turn, as sort of a consolation prize, Roddenberry is given stewardship of the Next Generation, the relaunch, the syndicated TV relaunch, and that's got 9 ideas. It's just baked in from the pilot, and I think it's also got Esalen ideas baked into it, because Esalen was known for the encounter groups. That was like their big calling card in the 60s, and of course the pilot of Next Generation is called Encounter at Farpoint. And Farpoint is basically very much sort of like an Esalen type operation. So, so Esalen and the 9 and all these kind of ideas are really baked into Star Trek: The Next Generation, and and of course, I mean, throughout the entire Star Trek franchise, and even up to this day, I mean, there are definitely kind of 9 ideas that were baked into sort of different plot lines in Star Trek Discovery. So, I mean, you can't really talk about Star Trek without talking about the 9, and you can't talk about the 9 without talking about this access of intelligence interests. Andrew Paharich, very famous CIA MK Ultra operative, and then this interesting shift of the program over to Britain, and concurrently with this shift, again we have this series on Doctor Who. But I think that Doctor Who is a very interesting phenomenon because it's not one of the reasons why I've never been really into the whole second wave of the second generation, the next generation of Doctor Who, is because to me the charm of Doctor Who was it's very theatrical like character, that it was done shot on sound stages, mostly interiors, on a much lower budget, much more limited budget, and the because of the lack of budget and special effects and so on and so forth. I mean, you really had to focus on the writing and the stories, and I think that the stories are much more interesting in the original incarnation than what they had later become. When you can spend a lot of money, you can take a lot of shortcuts, and I think you also had a much better generation of writers, guys who had been cut their teeth on radio drama.
Absolutely. I mean, probably
theater. Go ahead, Stephen.
Probably the most famous, actually, though, that was, of course, Douglas Adams, who would go on to create The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But, I mean, this was kind of another one. I think he had originally got involved with Doctor Who when he had pitched this series that would later become Pirate Planet as a radio drama, which Doctor Who concurrently had a radio drama going with the TV show. And that sort of began his introduction into the BBC, which would eventually lead to the radio drama of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which later was adapted into quite an excellent BBC series in the early 80s, which again, like Chris is saying, they didn't have all the special effects and what have you. So, I mean, they had to really just compensate with just really great storylines and so forth. And as with the Doctor Who franchise, I mean, there's also these kind of, esoteric hints and hitchhikers like the number 42, obviously, and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, this is definitely was really the bread and butter in this era was the writing, as Chris is saying.
Well, another person that we should bring up in relation to Doctor Who and this whole world, this whole orbit of occult and intelligence interests is Henry Lincoln. And Henry Lincoln, who was sort of the third writer on Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was really the feeder for the Da Vinci Code and that whole phenomenon. But Henry Lincoln had done a few series with the Second Doctor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, what I call the Mo Doctor, because he looked like Mo from the Three Stooges. Troughton. So he had written 3 separate storylines for that as well, and he'd also done a movie that a very interesting movie in my he had also let's see here, I'm just looking him up. Okay, so he'd done the Doctor Who series. Oh, but he'd also co-written a very, very interesting movie called Curse of the Crimson Altar, which, boy, if you haven't seen that, and you talk about a lot of these kind of themes, I cannot, anybody who's listening to this, if you haven't seen Curse of the Crimson Altar, just go watch it now. I mean, you can probably find it pretty easily on YouTube or whatever. I think it's, the copyright is even expired. I think it's in the public domain. But it was actually Boris Karloff's last picture, and Christopher Lee's in it. But it really, you'll see a lot of themes and motifs from alien abduction lore, and actually Mike Cleland who's your go-to man on anything to do with that subject, had he'd written sort of a post for me on my old blog, the Solar Satellite, about all the abduction tropes in this film. So yeah, so there are these interesting personages behind the scenes that people should really pay attention to, that are very fascinating and somewhat anomalous personages to be showing up and sort of speeding along this interesting connection between intelligence and pop culture and the occult, as well, because one of the things that I would argue, and have been arguing, is that MK Ultra was in no way scientific, and it was entirely a cult. Particularly like Ewan Cameron's methodologies, are very old and predate anything we know about modern science, and are entirely based in occult initiation rites. So.
Absolutely. And
Certainly, yeah.
if I could go back to Puharic a little bit and the Nine and the British angle, which, this is really a compelling one as well. But even going back to his original forays into ESP and so forth, which kind of climaxed with the seances with the Nine, I believe, on New Year's Eve of 1952. Uh, the foundation that he was working for at the time was known as the Round Table Foundation, if I remember correctly. And of course, that brings to mind the infamous Round Table group, or the Round Table movement that Carol Quigley described in Tragedy and Hope, and much more in depth than the Anglo-American Establishment, which is also the really subversive book that Quigley published, for anybody curious on that. If you really want to get a good insight into the Anglo-American Establishment, that's the one you want. And naturally, it's almost unreadable from how dry Quigley's prose is to boot. But trying to get back to topic, though. And within this roundtable foundation that was sponsoring Puharic's research, one of the biggest benefactors was Ava Alice Astor, who was a scion of the fabulously powerful Anglo-American Astor dynasty. I believe Puharic was probably having an affair with her or something to that effect, which probably partly explained her largesse to the foundation. Now, Alice was a part of the American branch of the Astor family, and her brother was a gentleman named Vincent Astor, and Vincent was extremely powerful. He effectively had been running an informal intelligence service in the United States in the interwar years that was very closely entwined with British intelligence. Specifically, his contact was a man named Sir William Wiseman, who had been essentially the head of all British intelligence in North America during the First World War. After the war, that particular war had come to a conclusion, he had taken a job, I believe, with Cohen and Loeb, or one of the big banking houses, and effectively had been running this informal intelligence network that was comprised of these various gentlemen's clubs in the United States and the UK at the time. So, I mean, Alice kind of grew up in the background of all this, with this really extensive connections to British intelligence that her brother was managing on her on behalf of them and so forth in the United States. And of course, Astor was the guy who really got the ball rolling on setting up, the first really formal, all-encompassing U.S. intelligence service that we had here, the Office of Strategic Service. William Donovan was almost surely brought into this orbit by Vincent Astor, and Donovan was, set up with the legendary Sir William Stevenson, who pretty much is the guy who did create the OSS for all sakes and purposes. But so yeah, getting back to Puharic, though, you have this, presence of the Astor family looming in the background, who were extremely close to the British establishment and who are sponsoring all of this research. And then, as Chris is kind of getting to, with Sir John Whitmore, I mean, in addition to being a race car driver, I mean, Whitmore was, very much within the British establishment. He had been educated at Eton College, which within the UK you have the expression in Old Etonian, and that's pretty much in reference to this. Almost all of the major leaders for just centuries now have been educated at Eton College. From there, he went into the Sandhurst Royal Military Academy, which is another big one for grooming officers in the British military and so forth. So, I mean, this was a guy who was just absolutely plugged into the pinnacle of British establishment. I mean, it's often emphasized that he had been a race car driver, but I mean, this guy had grown up in a very well connected family with a lot of ties to military and probably the intelligence community as well. And like Chris is saying, this is a very interesting time in terms of a lot of this, arcane research that was going on with MK Ultra and Artichoke and Often and whatnot. A lot of this stuff would start to be exposed in the mid 70s, around the time that we're talking about with Pyramids of Mars coming out. But the writing had already been on the wall for the CIA for several years ahead of time. And, going into how far we went to with the conspiracy theories about Watergate, they might have even realized when this, whole operation was initiated that this would be a potential fallout. And obviously, I mean, this research didn't just disappear, even though it was drummed out of official channels in the CIA. I mean, no doubt a lot of it did go into the deep private, but a decent amount of it was also outsourced to quote unquote friendly countries in this era. Of course, you see this in the Southern Cone in South America, especially with Argentina and Chile in this time frame. Um, South Africa, apartheid South Africa was another one that really seems to have picked up the slack with a lot of this stuff in the late 70s, the early 80s. I mean, really, you can almost see the manifestation of full-blown super soldiers with the 32nd Battalion, which later became the infamous mercenary firm Executive Outcomes. And Israel was also a big player in this, but at the forefront was the UK. The UK really seems to have taken over directly, doing a lot of the dirty work for the United States. And it's not just in terms of these, I mean, projects which Chris was talking about. I mean, it also went into the arms trafficking, the drug trafficking, and just, providing mercenaries and forces for going over the world and, securing Anglo-American interests that during the late 70s, early 80s, it was really difficult for the CIA to directly do. So this is very much in keeping with a lot of these projects being transferred over to the UK, and it certainly seems like concurrent with this, Doctor Who really emerged as a major pop culture phenomenon, and also one that was just, absolutely knee deep in the zeitgeist of, ancient aliens and so forth, that was beginning to emerge in the mid 70s. And in a sense, I mean, it could almost be seen as the British equivalent of Star Trek in terms of introducing a lot of these tropes to the populace at large.
Surely, it seems to me,
Oh, can I
without
mention one thing? Can I just mention one thing real quick?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Henry Lincoln, who we just discussed, as far as Doctor Who and Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the Da Vinci Code, and then this other film that everybody needs to see. He was basically the writer on the Doctor Who series story serial. I mean, however they
It's a
refer
series.
to it
It's a
as.
series.
Yeah. So the Web of Fear, the storyline was called, where we first see Unit. So
Ah, okay.
so.
So there
And
you
that's where we
go.
see, Colonel Lethbridge Stewart,
Yeah.
um, that very plummy chap, very memorable character who sort of became almost a co-star, and then of course, the whole idea of Unit really becomes front and center with the third Doctor, John Pertwee. Very much, that's the focus is the Doctor Who being sort of like this James Bond character. It's a remarkably versatile franchise. That you could have all these different actors come in and put their stamp on it. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's also kind of funny too. The companion for this whole era here was a guy named Fraser Hines, who was played by an actor, Jamie McCrimmon, and The chick who came up with Outlander was a huge fan of this era of Doctor Who, and that actually led to the creation of Jamie Fraser in Outlander, who was essentially a relation of Lord Lovett. In fact, he actually took over a lot of the real life exploits of Lord Lovett in the Outlander franchise too, to boot. So, yeah, I mean, Chris and I have always kind of talked about, you always find these bizarre syncs with the Fraser dynasty in some way or other as well. So, yeah, it's just, and then also, I mean, with the whole thing with Lincoln too, his involvement with Holy Blood, Holy Grail really shows that he was also a major factor in contributing this whole notion of the, Christ bloodlines, the Jesus bloodlines and whatnot, which really seems to have been a major bid to try to reintroduce this notion of aristocracy, of divine bloodlines, and so forth in the 1980s, at a time when it was really thought that we had finally moved beyond this insanity. So, that's another major factor. And the great
Yeah.
Jeffrey Gills. Go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to say that, I just wanted to just elucidate that a bit more. I mean, a lot of the ideas in Holy Blood and Holy Grail, and this whole idea of the Merovingians and the Priory of Sion and everything. I mean, this really came from European post-war fascism. That you can't really separate the two, especially French traditionalism and sort of fringe Catholic post-war fascism, and it's fascinating to me that it was so mainstreamed through these books.
Yeah, and I mean, then of course, in more recent years, I mean, it's kind of been expanded upon with the, alien DNA concepts being mixed into it as well. But and I mean, the thing with Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the great Jeffrey Gilson has written a bit about that, and his excellent work, Maggie's Hammer, which is a very scholarly account of the, arms trafficking that really ravaged the UK in the 1980s and beyond. And Gilson was in a position to know. I mean, he had known several of the figures, deep in this type of stuff, specifically a lot of the special operators, the SAS men and what have you, that were really tasked with carrying out these duties. And he insisted, from what he had been told, from at least one noteworthy SAS man who had been kind of a source, that they took this stuff with Holy Blood, Holy Grail very, very seriously. And it kind of went into this whole just notion of the chivalric orders protecting these types of legacies and so forth, and just the proliferation you see of these different orders of knighthood, be it the Knights of Malta, the Knights of St. John, the Knights of Lazarus, and so on and so forth. And, of course, this all ties in as well with what I was kind of getting at earlier, these, private military firms that had really been pioneered, at least by the British in the modern era, with the corporate structure and so forth. All this stuff had been outsourced, or first it had been outsourced from the U.S. to the U.K., and then they took it further into the deep private with these former SAS men. And there certainly seems to have been a belief in all this insanity with Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was essentially cooked up by a writer on the Doctor Who franchise. So yeah, it's a very strange web of connections, to put it mildly.
Well, I really recommend that people, if they're interested in the Doctor Who franchise and haven't ventured, past the modern incarnation, to start at the beginning. The first Doctor, the early episodes are much different in tone. You didn't have that kind of happy-go-lucky, sardonic flavor to it. It was very dark, and the Doctor was very much a sinister character in his earliest incarnations, played by William Hartnell, who was an actor who for whom I have a tremendous amount of affection, but was constantly flubbing his lines. It became sort of a joke, almost like a drinking game among Doctor Who fans. But I had first seen the first story, the first Hartnell story arc ever. My wife and I had gone to Dragon Con down in Atlanta, I think in 2007. And it was late and we were all wound up, and we wandered over to one of the hotels, and they were showing a lot of British sci-fi, stuff in this viewing room. And then they had showed the first Doctor Who episode ever with Hartnell, and I didn't even know what the hell I was watching. I was like, whoa, what's this? I mean, it was really dark, and the Doctor is very much an angry and sinister character, and it's very interesting to watch because you see how this idea evolved. But again, we know about Lincoln, and we've talked about the periods of Mars, but I'm sure if you do a little more digging, you're going to find a lot of interesting, maybe MI6 kind of people weaving in and out of this franchise, and certainly a lot of the ideas that the groups like the Nine People, which we're trying to promote, very much part and parcel of the Doctor Who legacy.
Well, of course,
Yeah,
and
without
this all kind of was produced by the BBC too, and of course, at the same time frame. I mean, in the background of all of this is the whole, Jimmy Savile thing that's, playing out in this time frame as well. So, yeah, I mean, there was clearly a lot of sinister things going on with the Beeb in this era and beforehand and beyond as well. And, that's certainly something Chris was saying too. I can attest to really the seriousness of the early Doctor. I haven't seen a lot of the first Doctor, but I mean, definitely looking at the Cybermen episodes from the era of the Second Doctor versus the Cybermen that appear in the 70s and 80s. I mean, the Cybermen in the 60s are just absolutely sinister figures. And by the 70s, they had really deteriorated into just these really campy villains to the point that you got to Silver Nemesis, which I think was the last appearance of the Cybermen in the original Doctor Who franchise. And yes, in this one, the Doctor's companion is destroying them by using pieces of gold that she's firing at them from a freaking slingshot. So it was quite a fall from grace, to put it mildly, from what was really one of the first on-screen villains that seemed to have pioneered this whole, I shouldn't say pioneered, but kind of captured this whole proto-transhumanist agenda, so to speak, the merger of man and machine and so forth. And certainly you can see the manifestation of the Cybermen. It was utterly terrifying, and certainly
Well,
would
also the Daleks too. I mean, the Daleks
yes, the Daleks as well.
they're basically just like genocide machines, really.
Yes, yes, yes. Though I actually think it was the Tom Baker era, though, when we finally figured out that the Daleks did have like organic beings inside of them. But yeah, I mean, they had basically been, and this really kind of went into the whole, Third Reich, Fourth Reich, whatever notion, where they had been genetically created to be these ultimate killing machines encased in this almost indestructible armor and so forth. So Doctor Who was definitely at the forefront of really, depicting some of the horrors that would come from this kind of transhumanist agenda that would later be picked up with, of course, famously the Borg and Star Trek.
All right,
yeah,
I'll
transhumanist agenda with aliens inside it. It's just I know you just said that, but it's interesting. I mean, it's important to state that way,
Mm-hmm. What were you
Yeah,
What
going
were
to
you saying, Chris?
I was just going to say, if you haven't seen it yet, there were a couple feature films made in the '60s with Peter Cushing playing the Doctor, and Doctor Who and the Daleks. I believe that's the title. Is if if you're interested in the franchise, and if you're interested in these sort of backstory and the concepts, I really recommend that film. Again, I mean, it's not something that you could get away with marketing towards kids today. It's definitely a much different tone.
Surely, yeah. And the first couple of seasons were shot kind of like Lovecraftian horror thriller sort of thing, whereas later and now it moves into just completely intellectual horror with some special effects that may be meant to be scary. But if you look at those first couple of episodes and everything's shot in this very like 80s serial killer kind of way or whatever. Just all of a sudden close up on some monster face and then somebody's on the ground screaming in agony and then switch
Well,
scene, it's rather different now.
another thing that we need to point out is that Doctor Who first premiered the day after the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's an
That's bizarre.
important thing to point out. So it's interesting that you look at these popular science fiction franchises, and there's such an effort to bleach out any sort of weird or controversial content by the the billion-dollar conglomerates that control them nowadays. But I think that a lot of that weirdness and these strange connections that we're referring to here are inseparable from the franchises themselves.
Certainly. I
Absolutely.
was going to say earlier when we were talking about it, it seems almost like without even looking into the deeper conspiracy or the actual connections between writers and intelligence and so forth, you can almost look at it like the original Doctor Who and Star Trek and Outer Limits were like a kind of template that would later be expanded into, on purpose, expanded into Stargate and countless other um, series and things like that. But I feel like with Outer Limits, Doctor Who, and Star Trek, there's just way too much going on. There's way too much forced into it for there not to be that kind of influence we've been discussing the whole show.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, and in some sense too, you also have to kind of wonder, I mean, how much of Doctor Who was itself, I mean, a kind of, in line with some of these behavior modification experiments and what have you we've been talking about. Of course, we were kind of hinting at this earlier, but Doctor Who was a kids show, okay? And despite that, it was extremely violent. In fact, I think it was actually listed as the most violent show in British television by the 1970s. Certainly the early, the 60s era Doctor Who does have that kind of whole air of a very low budget American horror film. I mean, almost maybe Night of the Living Dead-esque at times and whatnot. And it did reportedly quite frighten children who were watching it, despite the fact that it was supposed to be marketed to kids. So you also have this kind of whole element where children themselves are being traumatized by watching this show that was nominally supposed to be a kids show and family friendly and so forth. And despite the I mean, the kind of rather campiness that you had in the show about the 70s, I mean, it still kind of had this air of menace to it throughout a lot of that decade.
Well,
Yeah, and then
it's
we
funny.
right from that to J. Michael Starsinski and Captain Power as a transhumanist tale scaring kids all the way up into the early 90s. Starsinski, of course, responsible for all of Babylon 5. I'm sorry, Chris, what were you saying?
No, I just wanted to point out, because this is just contingent to what Stephen had just said. Night of the Living Dead had premiered in Chicago during a children's matinee. So back in the 60s, and before, you would have on Saturday mornings, you would have children's matinees. And even when I was a kid, I remember going to these things. When I was a kid in like the 70s, I think they sort of phased them out later on, at least as a regular thing. So you'd have this regular thing where you'd have these children's matinees, and Roger Ebert had done this essay talking about how they had filmed Night of the Living Dead during one of these matinees, and that it had just completely traumatized the audience. And he was sort of observing and recording how these kids were just like freaking out and screaming and crying, and it was just like this horror show. And that to me, given how powerful and intrusive the Chicago censor boards were during the 60s, I have a very difficult time believing that was some sort of oversight or accident. It definitely feels to me like some sort of test.
Chris, I
Uh,
was really hoping you would bring that up. What is the name of the piece you wrote on that in The Secret Sun?
golly, I don't even remember anymore.
Okay.
That was like 4 years ago, so it's just like that might
Yeah.
have well been like, in the Stone Age. But yeah, that was a very, very strange episode. And I recommend that, contingent on what Stephen was saying about like this franchise being for children, but also being rather violent and frightening. The Daleks were well known for scaring kids quite a bit at the time. So very, very interesting to read that Roger Ebert article, and I'm sure you can find it quite easily just by searching for it online.
Sure, and yeah, that's all I meant by the Captain Power bit of business. It seems like every time there's a live action show directed at kids, almost entirely, then the censors and the kids, and there's all kind of pushback. But the thing is released, and millions of kids do watch the film or the show, and I have no trouble believing any of this after finding, 80 cartoons that absolutely were marketed to only children and absolutely not only will go above kids' heads, but are either too disturbing, too focused on some intelligence agenda or mind control or whatever, and just seems like a very adult plot meant to have a combination of sort of a traumatization factor, making you vulnerable as an audience, and then feeding you a bunch of information that certainly isn't coming out of someone just saying, "Oh, let me sit down and write a kid's story," and it's all kind of happening at once.
Well, there was actually a phrase that entered UK pop culture, hiding behind the sofa, or some variation on that, and that later became associated with the Doctor Who. And this goes back to the 60s era, from children who were watching it who would actually have to go hide behind their parents' sofa for the frightening bits before they would come back out to see the remainder of the episode. And
Yeah.
certainly it kind of became a shorthand for the show as it went on. I mean, there's even apparently a display in the Museum of Moving Images in London that kind of celebrates, quote unquote, this aspect of the franchise. So yeah, I mean, definitely, this was probably the most popular science fiction show in the UK at the time, certainly the leading children's show, almost surely. And it was terrifying people.
Yeah. Um, did anybody else have anything? I was gonna wrap this up and just say a little bit of trivia. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Yep.
I think we did too. It's interesting if anybody out there likes the band the Mars Volta. If you listen to their interviews, they were so incredibly inspired by Doctor Who and love the franchise and love the show, even as kids. And when you listen to the Mars Volta's albums, they, between the actual songs, have a lot of interludes of just 70s sounding synth and weird machine noises. And when I had already suspected that what they were doing was trying to model these interludes after the Tom Baker series, when Tom Baker would just sort of be wandering through the set. It wasn't an actual scene interacting with other characters, but there are many scenes with Tom Baker where he's just walking around the outside of a house or walking through a bunch of hallways in some construction zone to make his way to wherever he's going. And in those transit scenes, they play this weird synth mechanical noise stuff. And if you make the connection, if you watch a few Tom Bakers or just one and watch for those scenes, and then you put on a Mars Volta record, it'll be immediately obvious that they were very much adore Doctor Who and were trying to copy this in multiple albums. For direct reference, I would say go to Francis the Mute and Pyramids of Mars and just sync up the interludes and see how similar they are. Well, you guys, thank you very much for joining me, and everybody have a good day, and thanks for listening to the show, and we'll see you guys next week.
Reset.